to have several new members here. You've met Richard Rothstein and Eric Hanushek. We also have Kyla Johnson-Trammel, who is a principal of Oakland Sequoia Elementary School and the student and family specialist for Oakland Unified School District. She's a third-generation Oakland educator. She's also taught in Oakland elementary schools and was an assistant principal in the Mount Diablo School District before joining Sequoia about 5 years ago. State Senator Carol Liu was elected to the California State Senate in 2008, was in the Assembly before that.
Correct.
Was herself a long-time school teacher and administrator.
Right.
And looking forward to getting the state-level perspective, as depressing as that might be at the moment. David Plank is the Executive Director of Policy Analysis for California Education, which is a consortium of policy analysts at several universities, Berkeley, Stanford, USC. That's correct. Yeah. And before that, David Plank was a professor at Michigan State University, where he founded and directed the Education Policy Center. I'd like to first go to Kyla Johnson-Trammel, just to get the principal's perspective. There's been a lot of discussion about the lack of adequate evaluation of teachers by principals for all kinds of reasons. I'm wondering if, just in the context of this discussion, how adequate do you think the evaluation systems are of teachers, and how valuable do you think value added could be in terms of your abilities to evaluate teachers?
So I think the current evaluation system is inherently flawed. It's very subjective because you can have one teacher, and depending on the principal's knowledge of instruction, maybe they taught, maybe they only taught a year, maybe they only have a certain range of instructional knowledge. One teacher could be rated as highly effective, and one teacher could be rated as not very effective at all. And actually, in some of our professional development for principals, we've done things like this where we've looked at teaching and rated teacher effectiveness, and it's been the whole gamut. And a lot of that, to me, comes back to the issue of, as a field, we don't have a good norming system for what is high-quality teaching in the 21st century for a diverse student population. So to me, until we're really aligned, not just in terms of schools and districts, but teacher credentialing programs as well. I mean, you can come out of UC Berkeley and have one sense of what good teaching is. There are online programs. There's a whole gamut in terms of what a teacher coming into the field is prepared to do. So with so many different definitions and everyone having their own conception of what's high quality teaching, I think it makes it very challenging to just use one evaluation that right now is just for one principal. Now, in terms of value added, I don't think that that's going to give us that much information either, because the CSTs are inherently flawed. And really,
CSTs?
Excuse me, California Standardized Testing.
Thank you.
And I'll give you an example from a principal's perspective on why I'm nervous. I'm very nervous about using that form of assessment to rate teachers. There's a lot of research to show that our current accountability system increases the level of gaining that administrators can do to actually increase test scores. And so for me as a principal, I've seen testing as that's the political part of my job, and in many ways separate from me being an instructional leader. So what I can do is I can take the California tests, I can take the release questions, and I can look and I can see, which specific standards are going to be tested the most for second grade, for third grade, for fourth grade, for fifth grade. And I can then just have my teachers just focused on those specific standards. So something that I've always brought up in a lot of my meetings is we know how important it is for all of our kids to be algebra ready. Yet in second grade, for example, the algebra standards aren't tested that much on the state test. So as a principal, do I make a decision, an ethical decision, and say, even though I know my kids need pre-algebraic skills from kindergarten, but since they're not going to be tested heavily in second grade, I'm not going to teach that and have the teachers focus on just the superficial basic facts? Do I do that because I know my job's tied to higher test scores so that I can stay there? And I also know real estate agents use test scores for people to say this is a good school, this is a good neighborhood. So it has effect on enrollment, which right now in Oakland, since we're a result-based budgeting district, so I know as a principal, if my enrollment drops, I lose money and I'm not able to fund my program. So there are political issues that I have to balance. So I do have to spend some of my time being a statistician and a politician and figuring out a plan for my test scores to rise, which I have, but in all consciousness, because my role is to have quality education, I've also spent time having a garden program, having arts integration at my school, when I know that's not necessarily going to be tied to higher test scores. So I'm saying all that to say, if we're moving to a system where if standardized test scores are tied to teachers, even if it's only a 4th or a 5th or a 10th, I think it's a misconception
4th or 5th, the 10th
of
the evaluation.
Exactly, or if a teacher is good or bad. I think we're moving in the wrong direction because we don't even have a sense of what is high quality teaching right now for a diverse population.
Can I just ask you just then specifically, do you know who are the effective teachers and not effective teachers in your school? And again, I don't want to suggest you are typical of anybody else other than your school. So, but just in terms of your...
I think I do one. I've been a teacher. I spend a lot of time in the classrooms. I believe in collective leadership and shared leadership, so I don't believe that it should be top down. I believe in developing norms, so as a school, we've been able to look at what's good teaching instruction. But I don't believe it should be just one person who's making those decisions. And we need unions to work together with us, both the administrative union and teacher union. The other caution is any assessment system that's just going to increase the number of firing, because that's not cost effective at all. It costs about $30,000 approximately to fire teachers. So we need to look at, is the evaluation system just to fire or clean house? Is it to support the teachers that are there? Because we know that we bring in teachers into schools and they don't have the skills to differentiate, to work with kids with IEPs, to work with kids who are English language learners. The gamut of issues that are just within school, and we're not even discussing all the non-school factors that we know have an effect on student performance as well.
Let me turn to Senator Liu. You've been a teacher, and you're also at the state. I mean, the state has committed under Race to the Top now to tie teacher scores or student scores to teacher evaluations. Although this obviously has to be
that's going to be very interesting, because I think the legislature did pass some of that legislation in order to be competitive, but since we didn't get the money, there may be, and the leadership has changed, there may be a diminution of pursuing the buck, so to speak, and maybe another look at what we need to do to improve student success.
So, in general, your response to this, to value added and tying test scores to teacher evaluation?
Well, I mean, I know that the State Board of Education reached out and included value added as a component of teacher evaluation. They don't have the authority to impose it on school districts, but they may take a pilot project, so to speak, just to test it out. It'll be very interesting because I don't know how far it'll go. I mean, there were several bills this last year, a couple of bills this last year, that tried to deal with teacher evaluation. One was carried by Senator Huff. It was the governor's bill, SB 955 or something like that. And then there was Senator Steinberg's bill to react to LA Unified's, the suit against LA Unified when they let go of about maybe 60% of some 3 schools that were in the lower deciles. And neither of those bills moved anywhere. So they're still sitting in the legislature. So I'm not sure about how far we go next year. We may just take a breather and take a look around to see what's going on.
Still have to pass a budget, right?
Yes, I understand at 4:45 today there's supposed to be a handshake. I wouldn't hold my breath.
Let me then go to David Plank. David, I mean, given all the problems that have been raised or issues around value-added assessment, are there any good or promising alternatives?
Well, that's a question that's been asked and answered in various ways over the course of this afternoon. The fundamental question is compared to what? There are clearly serious problems with value-added assessment. In fact, there are serious problems with any form of assessment. The evaluations that we currently use really don't discriminate among teachers. We look at their credentials, at their years of schooling, we look at their years of experience, and someone referred to them as drive-by evaluations, pro forma evaluations by their principals. That clearly doesn't give us much information about how teachers are doing. We then look at value-added assessment. We say, well, there are all these problems, and we sort of imagine a better alternative that would give us accurate information about how teachers are doing. The problem is that if you observe in classrooms, it's very difficult to get two observers to see the same things when they look at classrooms. Perhaps in the very best classrooms or the very worst classrooms, you can make those kinds of discriminations. But in fact, looking at classroom teaching, it's a very complex activity, and it's very contextualized, and different observers will come to very different judgments about what's going on in the classroom. So I think that the answer to your question, Lewis, is no, that there is no perfect evaluation system, and better observations, more detailed observations, more careful observations have to be a piece of an effective evaluation system, but I believe that value-added assessment systems do as well.
We did have a question. Somebody says that there are other teacher assessment programs, something called TAP, the teacher, the Millikan program, portfolio assessment, and then there's also the best beginning evaluation support for teacher, portfolio assessment in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. Anybody want to comment on those?
Well, I'll comment on one, and if no one else comments on a second, I'll comment on that. But I'll comment on portfolios. And we actually have very extensive experience with teacher portfolios through the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And the board takes lesson plans, takes student evaluations, takes video evidence of how teachers are doing in classrooms, and runs that through a very rigorous review process managed mainly by other teachers, and comes to what are quite sophisticated judgments about the effectiveness of teachers. The problem is that that's about 200 hours of teacher work that goes into the preparation of a portfolio, and many hours of evaluation work by either fellow teachers or administrators to do the evaluations. In a country with about 3 million teachers, that's a lot of hours. That's a very high-cost way to do performance evaluation if you want reliable results that are consistent across teachers.
Can I just come back to Kyla Johnson-Trammel about this portfolio assessment, because that is raised often. Is that feasible? Is it too time-consuming?
I think he's talking about more a large scale, and I mean, I think that's one of the reasons we always default to standardized testing, because it's cheap and it's easy. But obviously, it's not working. I would say that I think our biggest investment would come in better training teachers in terms of when they come into the profession, and also once they're in schools, a lot of that responsibility falling on the administrator to provide consistent professional development for teachers, not just the one-time workshops, but whether it's creating the conditions within the school so teachers can collaborate, so they have the time to collaborate. There's some research from the new Teacher Support Development Division, well now kind of defunct because of the budget cuts in Oakland, and what they found is only a quarter of teachers stay in Oakland after 5 years. And a lot of that is because they don't feel the support, they don't feel that they get the support for collaboration to be able to collaborate with veteran teachers on a variety of subjects, and also not having the support from administration. So I think there needs to be a lot more time, instead of spending so much time on teacher, what's effective, what's not effective, the conditions that our teachers are in. That's a lot of the problem, and I do think there's some things that we can do within the system to figure out more effectively how to support them so that they can do a better job.
Well, let me ask you just a question from the floor. All urban principals I know are overwhelmed by the workload due to lack of funding for administrators as classroom needs take priority. Would adequate funding to meet schools' need allow for more effective teacher evaluation? And this comes from a public school parent and teacher's wife.
I'm not convinced anymore that it's about money. And that's not to say we don't need more money, but I think sometimes it's what we're doing with the money and what we're spending our time on. Again, is it teaching to the test, or is it really trying to figure out what is good? And that it's very complicated. I mean, if we polled everyone here, I'm sure there would be a lot of variance in terms of what is effective teaching. So imagine doing that for a state, let alone, I found it very difficult just doing it for a school, and there are only about less than 400 kids in my school, in terms of 16 teachers really being normed on, and our focus has really been writing. So really, I mean, obviously we're teaching everything, but in terms of writing, that was our focus, and nonfiction writing, really spending time with protocols and performance-based assessments, it's very difficult. So the notion that this is going to happen overnight, and I think that is one of the things that hits a strong note with educators about value added, is that we're coming up with a simple solution for a very complex problem. And that could cause more harm in the long run for the kids that we're saying need to be better served.
Can I
interject
quick
here?
comment, and then we're going to Richard. Yeah.
Just a comment, an observation. I went to a charter school in my district last week. 25 teachers, a little over 400 kids. And there was the principal and the vice principal. That vice principal is what we call an instructional leader, because she makes it a point of evaluating or going over the lesson plans of every one of those teachers a week in advance. She goes into the classroom once a week to look at the progress, coaching, trying to ensure that that teacher is going to be successful. I mean, she spends the time doing that. What prevents our public schools from doing that? Oh, I hear it. So what is it that the state can do to relieve the burdens that you feel in the classroom that you could do better? Because I do agree, maybe it's not all about money. Maybe it's about the way we do business. And so what are some of the suggestions that would come that would relieve the burdens of paperwork and all this bureaucracy to make the system flow better, work better for both teachers and students?
I'll let that question percolate. A while ago to Richard.
Okay.
One of the issues is how one best starts a conversation. More than a conversation, actually, probably negotiations around these issues with the unions, the school districts, and policymakers. Do you have any thoughts on how one gets a constructive conversation going?
Well, in the last panel, I did suggest one way to get a constructive conversation going, and that is to look at the reality of what the performance of schools have been, rather than this myth that has been created of systemic failure. You know, the problem with this value added, as I see it, is that this is a solution in search of a problem. The big problems that we have in our education system today, and I'm not saying we don't have lots of problems at all points of it, but the biggest problems we have are at high schools. The achievement, on average, of even the most disadvantaged children in this country has been rising quite well at the elementary school level. Perhaps we could do better, perhaps not, but the place where we have the data is at the elementary school level, because that's where we test people every year. So because we have the data, that's where we're looking for the problem. We don't know how, nobody knows how to translate the great improvements that we've seen at elementary and middle schools into the high school level? I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question. We're not looking at it because we've got lots of good data at a place where we don't have a problem, and so that's where we're focused. I'd like to, let me pick up on something else that was just said. You know, I mentioned in the earlier panel that education is not the only institution where there's this great temptation to substitute to narrow quantitative measures for holistic evaluation. In the business world, forgive me for personalizing this, Jason, but I'm sure that at the LA Times, your editor does not supervise 25 reporters directly. There's no other institution in this country where professionals have the kind of supervisory ratios that we have in education. There are schools in California, I know, where one principal without an assistant principal supervises 30 or 40 teachers. Now, there's no way you can do a holistic evaluation of teachers with that kind of supervisory ratio. You know, I happen to know it was a polemical question. I happen to know in the newspaper world you don't have one editor supervising 30 reporters. Banks don't have one supervisor over 30 loan managers. Accounting firms don't have one supervisor over 30 accountants. It's impossible to do a holistic evaluation in that way. Now, can we reduce that ratio in education by redirecting funds in a more sensible way? Well, to a limited extent. But we can't get from 1 to 30 to 1 to 5 simply by redirecting funds. So we're not prepared to do a serious job at teacher evaluation, given the way we've structured education, the kinds of resources that we put into its administration. It's under-administered. How do we start the conversation? Well, there's a tremendous temptation in the public debate now to see all of this as a union problem. The reality is that any union contract requires an agreement between the employer and the union, in this case, in the case of education, between the administration and the union. And the final say, unless teachers are prepared to strike, is the employers. So the reason for these dysfunctional rubber rooms and all these things that keep it, it's not the unions. I mean, Michael Bloomberg in New York has been in control of the New York City education system for 7 years now. And yet recently, there was an article in the New Yorker denouncing rubber rooms as the fault of the teachers' union. Why hasn't Michael Bloomberg taken them out of the teachers' contract? This is not a strike issue. The teachers' union in New York would not have struck over an expedited arbitration system to remove the worst teachers. Teachers' unions strike over wages and benefits and job security and that sort of thing. So this is, I don't know why they don't do it. I think it's a question of incompetence and collective bargaining on part of the school district administrations. And we could, if you accept my view that we don't have a systemic problem with the quality of teaching at the elementary and middle school level, but we do have, you know, ineffective teachers who should be removed, small numbers of them, we could do that very easily with easy modifications of teacher union contracts that are totally in the control of school district administrations and that the unions would not be able to say a thing about.
Okay, just as a rebuttal, I will read this question, rebuttal question. Haven't teachers' unions shot themselves in the foot by arguing so vociferously against using test scores for evaluation, thereby taking it out of the arena of protected personnel data? Do you understand that? Okay, well, let me explain.
I understand it.
Yeah,
I understand it.
basically, I think it does speak to the LA Times. They were able to get the information on teachers because it was not part of their personnel files. If it had been part of the personnel files, the LAUSD would not have been able to release it.
I think that actually reinforces Richard's point rather than undermines it, which is to say the district chose not to ever, they simply collected the data and archived them and never looked at them, and as a consequence the data were not part of the evaluation system and therefore not protected under FOIA, so that they became publicly available. It's that wasn't I don't believe that was a union problem. That was an administration problem.
And the other question was, what would stop any parent from making a Freedom of Information request or kind of California Public Records Act request for their local data for publication? And this would make statistical objections irrelevant. But I guess a parent would have to go and do their own value added.
Right.
It would be quite complex, but yeah. Richard, Eric Hanushek, if you could just comment on how is there a way to start a conversation that's productive between the unions and the districts and the teachers around this issue?
Well, this has been something that we've tried for a long time. I just completely disagree with Anthony that this is a war on teachers. I don't think that's it at all. I think that the average teacher is really very, very good, works very, very hard, and not in the best of conditions and working conditions and circumstances. And there might be some people who argue that the average teacher shouldn't be in the schools. I'm not one of those. I do, on the other hand, argue that the small number of teachers, and I suspect that you might have identified some in your own school who are not doing an effective job, should in fact be dealt with in one way or another. And that's the whole thing. Now let me put this into perspective. Richard says, well, we're doing great at the 4th and 8th grade level. In 8th grade math, if you rank nations by math performance, we're 26th. I don't know if that's great. Maybe we're doing better. Actually, in the international test, we have not improved relative to other nations. This makes a big difference. I don't want you to think that test scores are something irrelevant. There is consistent evidence from many studies about the value of more knowledge as measured by these tests in terms of future incomes of people. You can put that into perspective in terms of teacher quality variations. A teacher who's in the 90th percentile, that's good, in the top 10% of the nation, compared to the average teacher, produces about $500,000 in extra future income, lifetime income, compared to the average teacher for a class of 20. And you add that up. That's what the numbers suggest. The numbers suggest just the opposite for a 10th percentile teacher, the bottom 10%. Compared to the average, the bottom 10% of the teacher is costing $500,000. This seems like, to me, not a matter, this seems like a matter that we should take up. As a nation, if we could be Finland, which is at the sort of top of these scores, there's pretty strong evidence that it is worth in future, the present value of future gains to the U.S. economy of $100 trillion. 2%
child poverty.
So let's deal with this issue. There is no doubt, and no researcher that I know has ever said that family background is not extraordinarily important. That is not an issue. We understand that. We don't have the means to change families, or we're not willing to use that as a nation. We do have the means to adjust what our schools do. That's our public policy instrument. That's why some of us spend all of our time not looking at how to change families, but how to change the schools. There's absolutely no evidence. There is no evidence that if we gave $10,000 a year more income to poor families, that the achievement of those kids would increase. There's absolutely none. Now that's not to say, that is not to say that we might not for societal purposes, and I believe it, that we should worry about the income levels of the poor people, but not because that's the way to solve our school problems, or that we have to wait till we equalize incomes before we try to address some of these achievement problems that are extraordinarily real. So let me just finish the answer to the question. This is the introduction. The introduction is that I think that the dialogue that I hear when I talk to Randy Weingarten is that she doesn't want to defend teachers that aren't doing their job. And nobody does. The question is, how do we have a discussion and have the discussion about how do we take care of the bad teachers? In terms of Washington, D.C., Randy Weingarten said this repeatedly, that she didn't care about that, but she wanted to introduce no evaluation. And she fought Michelle Rhee to the point where Michelle Rhee made a unilateral decision, which may not have been the right one, but could not, in 2 years of negotiating, lead to a system that eliminated teachers who were harming kids. And that's the whole issue. It's not that we want to turn over and replace all teachers, in my opinion. In my opinion, it's let's stop defending the really poor teachers and find systems that effectively remove them, not that violate their due process rights, but due process doesn't mean $200,000 per bad teacher. Every good principal does that once in a career.
Can we just, do you have a quick comment, Richard? Because I wanted to get to the, well, hold that then, hold that.
Well, wait, Rick and I have been talking about this for 30 years or 20 years or something. So let me just say one quick thing. You know, I want to comment about the character of the debate in this country about these issues. It's filled with caricature and oversimplification. I mean, I commented before about, you know, not making the distinction between the fact that schools are not in a state of collapse and that everything is hunky-dory and doesn't need to be improved. I'd like to take up Rick's comment that the choice is between equalizing incomes or improving the achievement. That's not the choice. The choice is between doing something about the family circumstances of children who come to school not ready to learn and not doing anything about it. We get a lot more purchase out of doing something about it than we would out of many of the school reforms that are being advocated. I talked before about just one sentence.
One program?
Yes, I can. If I had if I had the money to reduce the principal-teacher ratio to a reasonable level where you could evaluate teachers, you'd get much more bang for the buck from taking that money and putting a health clinic in those schools than you would by putting more principals in the schools. That's an example.
In terms of achievement.
Yes, in terms of achievement. Yeah.
What I'd like to do, is, if we are running out of time, but to focus on where we go next in terms of obviously value added. When you think about it, it actually does, all it does is identify, according to this system, certain the most effective or least effective teachers, according to this system, and in a limited way, as many people on the panel have pointed out. But what do we do? What about the other programs that are in place? There's the Peer Assistance Review Program, there's this BITSA program, several other programs that are in place. I mean, the goal surely is to improve the teaching of everybody. David.
California is not to put it too strongly, but shamefully behind on these issues. You mentioned TAP, which is a program that originated in California, that's based in California. There are no TAP school districts in California. We did. I believe that at the end of the day, 3 of the nearly 1,000 California school districts applied for teacher incentive funds. California, innovation is going on across the country on these issues, and it's going on in partnership between unions and school districts. And it's simply not happening in California. San Francisco did some very modest reforms a couple of years ago, funded by Proposition A, the Quality Teacher Education Act. Those are still, within the district and across the state, matters of huge controversy. By national standards, they're almost trivial reforms. So I think that we in this state have yet to engage seriously with these issues. We really are falling farther and farther behind in a national conversation about how to evaluate teachers effectively and fairly, and how to steer our evaluations towards the improvement of learning. I do want to say two California school districts did win teacher incentive fund grants and will be experimenting with new forms of evaluation. One of those is Lucia Mar down near San Luis Obispo, and the other is North Humboldt High School District. These are well-known leaders in the state in education policy, gain great attention from the state media, but they're the only districts in California that were willing to experiment with value-added assessment.
Okay. Carol?
Well, I would agree with David. It's been very frustrating to me over my tenure in the legislature, having been a teacher, that we look for best practices, trying to figure out what we're not doing in terms of improving the conduct of our education system, all with the lens of, as far as I'm concerned, with student success, and I chaired higher education when I was in the assembly. And our examples that we look at are not coming from within, they're coming from without. And for instance, I'm an advocate of preschool, and so I know I go to Maryland, I go to New Jersey, I go elsewhere to find out where programs are really successful for young kids, and they're not coming from here. So, it is, what is it about us who've always led this discussion that we can't seem to get started again, because there certainly are creative folks here in California. And it's, and it is perhaps priority, in terms of the money, but, the money is, we're spending, again, this, I think if the budget gets passed at 20 minutes, with a handshake, the budget won't come until the next week, but, we spend close to $50 billion, but, we've already taken $18 billion out of the system over the last 18 months, so, I understand that, and it's, but we just can't, you can all help me with this conversation, because it's very difficult for some of us, and very, very painful for some of us to pass these budgets that with,
Senator, in your experience, why is it so difficult?
We have to go through a 2/3 vote to get a budget.
But in general education reform in California?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because there are a few teachers in the legislature and administrators. So I'm not sure why it's so difficult. I know this last year has been very difficult because, two of our members were running opposed to each other for the superintendent of schools, and so it's a total political morass, so to speak, and we'll see what happens in November. But that...
Can I just jump in with,
yeah.
with the question? It says from the audience, preparing our students for the 21st century necessitates the most qualified students entering the teaching profession. Yet with current conditions affecting education, including our state budget, lack of competitive pay, and now value-added measures for evaluation, how do you propose to attract good teachers into the profession who have the qualifications to teach?
I would agree. I think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult, and I've been a proponent of investing more in our just listen to this, School of Education. Somebody said to me, why don't we just get rid of our schools of education, because maybe that's not where we produce our best teachers. Maybe we should take another look at how we do that. How do we produce our teachers? You can have schools of education if you want a master's or a PhD or an EDD, et cetera, but not to produce the frontline person in the classroom.
But I would also just say that the effect of a teacher is in relationship to the effect of the organization. It's not just the teacher. It's the teacher in conjunction with the principal, in conjunction with the larger school system and the state. So I think that's the danger in just extrapolating the teacher as this isolated entity, even if we can increase the number of teacher effectiveness, which we still don't quite know what that means. That it's a bigger issue. So for me to stay in this work, because it's easy to burn out, is just for me to kind of take my role as a principal and what can I do to create conditions so that teachers can do a better job. But also, I think it's just ridiculous. We're one of the few professions where it's not assumed that people need to continue their training.
Right.
I mean, that's a huge problem, and that's a money issue. But it's also part of policy, because there's really no incentive for a teacher for you to continue your training. So then that's another issue that needs to be addressed as well. But I think as long as we keep just talking about the teacher as this isolated entity, that's going to fix this problem. And I'm just talking about school factors, because the non-school factors will be here all night. But just in terms of the school factors, we have to think about this problem as an organizational problem, and not just the teacher.
Can I just add on to that, that part of this discussion, I think, is really distorted. So maybe it's right that we're attacking teachers. If you're going to have value added and performance pay for teachers, you can't do that in a system that does not similarly have value added and performance measures for administrators.
Right.
And so part of this discussion is a little bit distorted, that is if we ignore the administrators and let the teachers
But you
go on.
kind of do, because my ability to continue to be a principal is my test scores to a large extent. But I would argue that that's not the most effective measure of my effectiveness as an instructional leader. So.
And I just wanted to read some comments from the audience. I don't think they're questions. One is Mr. Felcher's introduction described how teachers long for feedback so they don't have to teach in isolation and improve their practice. Why don't the reformers talk about providing those supports before using this untested to improve teaching approach? We also get this from a parent. Today we are hearing a lot of discussions of why the LA Times did a bad thing, why we have a war on teachers, etc. At least we are having the conversation. Where are the proposed solutions? Where is the discussion on what evaluations work? Parents cannot choose their teachers and have no information on what drives quality teaching. We need transparency and leadership from our educators. There's also another one from a parent of a public school children in San Francisco. I urge those who are defending the teachers in this war to give us, the parents, a reason to sit back and wait for someone to do something to make sure we have great teachers. We had 2 teachers that by any evaluation you would not want to teach your child. What happened? They moved to other low-performing schools. What should we do as parents? I just read those because obviously these are strong opinions on various sides. David.
Can I uncharacteristically end on an optimistic note? There are a couple of opportunities before California that we could take advantage of. One is that our data systems are still basically on life support, but the progress towards an effective data system could be accelerated. I mean, we've actually sort of built the foundation, and it would be possible for the state to collect better data than they now do. The second is that the California assessment system sunsets in 2013, and it's going to be renewed, and this represents an opportunity to begin to think about what better assessments would look like. We're unsatisfied with the assessments we have now. What would better assessments look like? And that conversation had better go on in the next 2 years, because if it doesn't, we'll simply renew what we have now. And the third is something that Senator Liu mentioned, but you know, the legislature at least can ensure that districts have the flexibility to experiment. That we see some willingness to experiment in a handful of California school districts, protecting that flexibility and to the extent it's possible expanding it so that we see more experimentation and more policy learning, I think is the only way we're going to move down this road.
Can I just use the moderator's prerogative to address a question to Jason Felch? Do we have a microphone? In terms of where the LA Times goes from here, because I think, certainly to me, for the LA Times to be in this position of actually driving public policy and, as you said, doing something that you felt the district should be doing. If LAUSD decided to do this and set up a value-added system that was a portion of the total evaluation, would you guys say, okay, we're done? Or is this going to be something the LA Times is going to be doing in perpetuity?
There's a lot of things that can be done with longitudinal data that go well beyond evaluating teachers. So I want to correct something Richard said, which is that this data isn't available at other grade levels. We started with elementary school, but there is data available through middle school and high school. And we do plan on analyzing that data. We have the data covering 8 years of middle school and high school. It's complex to analyze it because a lot changes, so the model shifts. But that information is available and ultimately will be made public. But teacher evaluation is the beginning of this conversation, not the end. There are incredible lessons to learn from this data. For example, if you know that 8th grade algebra is a predictor, that failing 8th grade algebra is a predictor of dropouts, you can use longitudinal data to predict in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade which kids are on track to fail 8th grade algebra. And school districts could be using this to get those kids help before they fail, as opposed to after they fail. And so there is the ability to look at school level change and to identify which schools have produced a turnaround in their performance, and go in and there's a big debate about school turnaround and how do you do it. Well, one thing you can do is use the data to look at schools that have done it and to unpack how and why. So there's a wealth of information in here that can be explored that goes well beyond just the issue of teacher evaluations. And I think it's fair to expect that over the coming months and years, we'll be looking at that data in through all these different lenses and trying to draw conclusions that advance this debate.
Well, I think on that note, it sounds like we're going to be having more of these kinds of symposia. I want to thank you all for what I think has been an extraordinarily illuminating discussion. We may not have come up with answers, but we, I think, at least have engaged in a very civil and rational conversation, which is not easy to do in the current climate. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the Graduate School of Education at UC Berkeley for hosting this event. And thank you all for coming.
I've learned from